May 16, 2020. Downtown Los Angeles, 6:26 p.m. The alarm bell rings through Fire Station 9 in Los Angeles' Skid Row district. The sound is so familiar to the crew that it barely interrupts their evening routine. They've heard it dozens of times today already. Station 9 is the busiest firehouse in the United States, averaging nearly 100 emergency calls every single day. For the firefighters on duty this Saturday evening, this is just another call in an endless stream of emergencies. Captain Scott Barkley looks up from the card game he's been playing with his crew. They'd just finished dinner and were deciding who would do the dishes using their station tradition, a dice game. Barkley had rolled snake eyes and lost, which got a good laugh from everyone. Now, with dishes forgotten, he and his team are pulling on their heavy protective gear and heading for the trucks. The dispatch comes through: structure fire, commercial building, moderate smoke reported. It sounds routine. In downtown LA, small commercial fires are common. The crew has handled hundreds of them. As Rescue 209 and other units roll out of Station 9, nobody has any reason to think this call will be different from any other. Nobody knows that in less than 40 minutes, 11 firefighters will be fighting for their lives. Nobody knows that this routine structure fire will become one of the most harrowing incidents in Los Angeles Fire Department history, and nobody knows that the cause will be something that should never have been in that building in the first place. Thousands of pounds of illegally stored, hazardous materials that are about to turn a simple warehouse fire into a double explosion that will trap firefighters on a burning roof and inside a building that has become a bomb. This is the story of the Boyd Street fire, how ignored warnings, illegal storage, and a perfect storm of circumstances combined to create an inferno that nearly killed 11 firefighters. It's the story of extraordinary courage in the face of unimaginable danger, of split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death, and of how a routine Saturday evening call became a desperate fight for survival. Station 9 sits in one of Los Angeles's most challenging districts. Skid Row is an area of roughly 50 city blocks in downtown LA that has the largest stable population of homeless people in the United States. The neighborhood faces constant challenges: poverty, addiction, mental illness, and a concentration of social problems that would overwhelm most communities. For the firefighters of Station 9, this environment means constant work. The station doesn't just handle fires, they respond to medical emergencies, overdoses, homeless encampment fires, vehicle accidents, hazardous materials incidents, and everything else that can go wrong in an urban area with limited resources and overwhelming needs. 100 calls per day means the crew is constantly responding, constantly moving, constantly ready. There's barely time to eat, to rest, to maintain equipment between emergencies. This relentless pace creates a unique culture at Station 9. The firefighters bond intensely because they depend on each other constantly. They know each other's families, each other's fears, each other's strengths and weaknesses. When you're running into burning buildings or pulling overdose victims back from death multiple times every single day, you develop connections that go deeper than ordinary workplace relationships. Station 9 isn't just a job, it's a brotherhood forged in constant crisis. Captain Scott Barkley embodied this culture. An experienced firefighter with years of service, he had the calm competence that comes from having seen everything. He knew his crew trusted him, and he took that responsibility seriously. Every decision he made could mean life or death for civilians they were trying to save, for his crew, for himself. The weight of that responsibility was something he carried every single shift. On this particular Saturday evening in May 2020, Barkley was on duty with 18 other firefighters. The COVID-19 pandemic was still new, creating additional stress and uncertainty. Firefighters were considered essential workers, responding to emergencies throughout the lockdowns, wearing additional protective equipment, worrying about bringing the virus home to their families. But the work continued. Emergencies don't stop for pandemics. The crew had just finished dinner together, a rare moment of normalcy in their hectic schedule. Someone had suggested a dice game to determine who would do dishes, and Barkley had lost fair and square. The crew was still laughing about his bad luck when the alarm sounded. The dispatch information was straightforward: structure fire at 327 East Boyd Street, commercial building, moderate smoke visible. The address was in an area locals called Bong Road, a district filled with shops selling smoking accessories, glassware, vaporizers and related products. Fires in this area weren't uncommon. Many of the businesses operated out of older buildings with questionable electrical systems and stored inventory in ways that created fire hazards. As the trucks rolled out of Station 9, Barkley ran through the standard mental checklist. Commercial building meant business occupancy, likely empty on a Saturday evening. Moderate smoke meant the fire was established but not yet out of control. The location meant narrow streets, difficult access, possible hazmat concerns from whatever products were stored in the building. All routine considerations for an experienced crew. The first units arrived on scene at 6:30 p.m., just 4 minutes after the initial dispatch. This rapid response time was typical for Station 9. They were close to everything in their district, and speed mattered. Every minute counted when fire was spreading, when people might be trapped, when a small fire could become a major conflagration. As the trucks pulled up, Barkley immediately began his size up, the rapid assessment that determines strategy and tactics. He saw a single-story commercial building, maybe 70 yards deep, with a flat roof. Light to moderate smoke was visible, coming from the rear of the structure. The smoke was white to light gray, suggesting the fire was burning ordinary combustibles rather than plastics or chemicals that would produce darker smoke. Nothing about the scene screamed danger. The building had large rolling steel doors at the front, the kind used for loading docks or warehouse access. This was both good and bad. Good because large openings meant easier access and ventilation, bad because these doors could be difficult to force open if they were locked or damaged. Barkley's crew approached the first door and began working to open it. What they found immediately complicated the situation. When they finally got the rolling door open, they discovered that the building was packed floor to ceiling with storage racks loaded with merchandise. There was literally no way to walk into the building through this entrance. The racks blocked the entire doorway. Whoever operated this business had utilized every cubic inch of space for storage, with no regard for fire safety, access, or building codes. "We're trying to find an entrance," one firefighter radioed back to command. "It's going to be really hard for us to get in. We got a moderate amount of smoke right now coming out of the side." This was concerning but not unprecedented. Many businesses in this area operated with minimal regard for regulations, cramming inventory into every available space to maximize profit. It made the firefighters' job harder, but they'd dealt with similar situations before. The crew moved to try another entrance. They found a second door that opened into a narrow hallway, approximately 4 to 5 feet wide. This was barely enough space for a firefighter wearing full protective gear and carrying equipment to squeeze through. The hallway was lined with more storage racks, creating a claustrophobic passage that extended deep into the building. It was the only way in. "We have access through a side door," the crew reported. Narrow hallway, maybe 4 feet wide. Heavy smoke banking down. "We're advancing the line." While some firefighters prepared to enter through this narrow hallway, Captain Barkley made a tactical decision that was standard practice for this type of fire. He would take a crew to the roof to begin vertical ventilation. Ventilation is crucial in firefighting. It allows heat and smoke to escape, which improves visibility for crews working inside and can prevent a fire from reaching flashover conditions where everything in the room simultaneously ignites. Roof ventilation involves cutting holes in the roof to create vertical openings through which heat and smoke can rise and escape. It's a standard tactic, one that firefighters train on extensively. Done correctly, it makes interior firefighting safer and more effective. But it requires putting firefighters on top of a burning building, which carries inherent risks. An aerial ladder truck positioned itself near the building, extending its ladder to the roof. Captain Barkley and several crew members climbed up, carrying tools including chainsaws for cutting ventilation holes and pike poles for testing the roof's integrity. At approximately 6:45 p.m., the roof crew began their work. The roof appeared solid, concrete or similar construction that could support their weight. This was good. Firefighters are trained to constantly test roof integrity because a weakened roof can collapse, sending them falling into the fire below. Barkley's crew moved carefully across the roof toward the area where smoke was venting most heavily from the building. They reached approximately the 75-yard line near the rear of the building and began cutting their first ventilation hole. This keyhole cut would allow them to assess conditions and determine where larger ventilation openings should be made. As the saw bit through the roof material and the hole opened, smoke began venting upward as expected. But one of the firefighters noticed something odd. The smoke coming from the ventilation hole didn't look quite right. Later he would describe it as having a wavy, distorted kind of smoke condition similar to what you see behind a jet engine over hot asphalt. The smoke seemed to shimmer and distort the air around it in a way that wasn't typical of ordinary structure fires. This observation was significant, though its importance wouldn't be clear until later. Experienced firefighters develop an intuitive sense for reading smoke. Its color, its movement, its texture all provide information about what's burning and how hot the fire is. Smoke that creates visible heat distortion suggests extremely high temperatures, possibly approaching or exceeding flashover conditions. But in the moment, working in the noise and confusion of an active fire scene, this observation was just one data point among many. Another firefighter glanced toward the rear of the building and noticed something else unusual: flames that appeared to be shooting out horizontally rather than rising vertically as fire normally does. Fire naturally rises because hot gases are less dense than cool air. Horizontal flame movement suggests extremely high heat and pressure, potentially indicating that the fire is burning in a confined space and seeking outlets wherever it can find them. Again, this was concerning but didn't trigger an immediate evacuation order. Fire behavior can be unpredictable, and experienced firefighters see unusual phenomena regularly. The question is always, does what we're seeing indicate immediate danger, or is it just part of the normal variation in how fires behave? Making this judgment call is one of the most difficult aspects of firefighting command. Meanwhile, the crew that had entered through the narrow hallway was making slow progress into the building. The hallway remained narrow, with storage racks on both sides creating a claustrophobic tunnel. Visibility was deteriorating as smoke banking down from the ceiling. The crew advanced slowly, dragging fire hoses behind them, testing each step forward. About 3 to 4.5 meters past the entrance, they encountered another obstacle: a ladder. Not a firefighting ladder, but a regular ladder that was apparently part of the building's equipment, now blocking their path. There was only about a 2-foot gap to squeeze through alongside the ladder. This created a dangerous bottleneck. If they needed to exit quickly, this narrow gap would slow them down significantly, potentially fatally. Using a pike pole, a long pole with a hook and point used for pulling ceilings and testing structures, one firefighter probed upward and discovered there was a mezzanine level above them. This meant the building's interior was more complex than it appeared from outside, with multiple levels and likely multiple fire loads. The situation was becoming more complicated. Then suddenly conditions changed dramatically. The smoke, which had been brownish and relatively thin, allowing some visibility even if limited, turned completely black and dropped to floor level. In firefighting, this rapid change in smoke conditions is often a warning sign. It can indicate that the fire has found new fuel, that ventilation conditions have changed, or that flashover is imminent. Whatever the cause, it meant visibility had gone from poor to non-existent in seconds. It was like someone slammed a door behind us, one firefighter later recalled. One moment we could see a little bit, the next moment it was absolute black. We couldn't see our hands in front of our faces. At approximately 6:57 p.m., just 11 minutes after the roof crew had begun ventilation operations, firefighters began hearing unusual sounds. First, there was a low rumbling noise, like distant thunder or heavy machinery. Some initially thought it was the roof crew walking around above them, their footsteps transmitted through the structure, but the sound grew louder and more ominous. Then came popping sounds, like firecrackers or small arms ammunition cooking off in a fire. Pop, pop, pop. The sounds were sporadic at first, then became more frequent. Pop, 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 pop. The firefighters inside recognized these sounds. They'd heard them before when aerosol cans or butane lighters exploded in fires. But the frequency and intensity were beyond anything they'd experienced in a typical commercial fire. "We're hearing a lot of popping inside," someone radioed. "Might be aerosols or pressurized containers." This was significant information. Pressurized containers, aerosol cans, propane tanks, butane canisters are extremely dangerous in fires. As they heat up, the pressure inside increases until the container fails catastrophically, essentially becoming a small bomb. A few exploding cans are manageable, many exploding simultaneously can create a blast wave and rapidly spread fire throughout a structure. The popping sounds continued and intensified over the next 30 to 60 seconds. They became louder, more frequent, almost continuous. Pop, 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 crack, 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 crack. The sound was evolving from small firecrackers to something much more powerful. Then the building began to shake, not just vibrate from the fire and the equipment, but actually sway and move as if hit by an earthquake or explosion. Captain Barkley, still on the roof, later described the sensation. It felt like standing directly under a roller coaster as it goes by you, except it just kept going. The whole building was moving, shaking, vibrating. Inside the building, the heat intensified dramatically within seconds. Firefighters' protective equipment, designed to withstand extreme temperatures, was reaching its limits. They could feel the heat through their turnout coats, through their helmets, through their gloves. The air itself seemed to be burning. Back up, voices shouted over the radio. The calm, controlled communication that had characterized the operation so far was giving way to urgency. Back up, for a minute. The popping sounds crescendoed into a continuous roar. Multiple firefighters later described it as sounding like the space shuttle launching or like a freight train going by at full speed. The sound was so loud that it was difficult to hear radio communications or shouted warnings. At exactly 7:01 p.m., just 16 minutes after the first units had arrived on scene and thought they were dealing with a routine structure fire, everything changed in an instant. The building exploded. It wasn't a single explosion but rather a massive deflagration, a rapidly moving flame front that raced through the structure at extraordinary speed, fed by something far more volatile than ordinary commercial contents. A fireball erupted from every opening in the building, shooting out the front doors, blasting through windows, roaring up through the ventilation holes in the roof. The blast wave was powerful enough to knock firefighters off their feet. The thermal pulse was so intense that it ignited everything combustible within seconds, and the firefighters, both inside the building and on the roof, were caught directly in its path. Captain Barkley and his roof crew were working near the ventilation holes when the explosion occurred. One moment they were cutting and probing, the next moment a column of flame shot up through the hole directly beneath them. The fireball engulfed them completely, a wave of superheated gas and flame that burned through their protective equipment as if it weren't there. Everything just flashed, Barkley later recalled. There was no warning, no build-up, just instant fire everywhere. My helmet, my coat, my gloves, everything was on fire. I looked at my hands and they were burning. Inside the building, the firefighters who had advanced down that narrow hallway were hit even worse. The explosion occurred behind them, between them and their only exit. The blast wave knocked them forward onto their hands and knees. The heat was indescribable, far beyond anything their protective equipment was designed to handle. Their coats and pants, made of fire-resistant materials designed to withstand hundreds of degrees, began to fail. The heat was burning through. And then they remembered the ladder. That narrow gap they'd squeezed through to get into the building. That was the only way out, and it was now behind them, through the heart of the explosion, through temperatures that would kill them in seconds if they were exposed. One firefighter tried to stand up to orient himself and immediately felt searing pain across his back. Standing meant raising his head and body into the superheated gas layer that filled the upper portion of the hallway. His protective coat and shirt burned through in seconds, the flesh underneath blistering and charring. He dropped back down, screaming. "We need to get out. Now," someone shouted. But getting out meant going back through that narrow gap, past that ladder that was now knocked askew and blocking even more of the hallway, through a tunnel that had become a blast furnace. On the roof, Captain Barkley's immediate thought was to get his crew off the building before it collapsed or before another explosion occurred. An aerial ladder had been positioned against the building's side, offering a way down. But between the roof crew and that ladder was a section of roof that was now fully involved in flames. "Come on, let's move," Barkley shouted, pushing his crew toward the ladder. Go. But moving toward the ladder meant running across a roof that was on fire, toward a ladder that was also on fire. The aerial ladder, made of metal, was conducting heat from the flames below and was hot enough to burn on contact. Some firefighters froze. Their training warring with their survival instinct. Training said to move deliberately and carefully, to test each step, to maintain team integrity. Survival instinct said to run, to get off this burning building immediately before it collapsed or exploded again. Several firefighters, their protective equipment already burning, simply ran and jumped onto the aerial ladder. Others, more hesitant or disoriented by the smoke and flames, had to be pushed or pulled toward the escape route. Every second mattered. The roof might collapse at any moment, or another explosion might occur. As the first firefighters began descending the aerial ladder, they looked down and saw a sight that turned their fear into outright terror. The front of the building, directly below them, was shooting flames horizontally outward. The ladder they were climbing down was positioned directly in the path of this flame jet. They were climbing down through fire. I looked at myself and everything was just completely on fire, one firefighter later recounted. My hands, my arms, my facepiece, my helmet, everything was burning, and I was climbing down a metal ladder that was so hot it was burning my hands even through my gloves. The firefighters on the ladder found themselves in an impossible situation. Above them, the roof was burning. Below them, flames were shooting out of the building. The ladder itself was so hot it was burning them. And they were wearing 60 pounds of equipment that was now on fire, making every movement exhausting. Then at 7:04 p.m., just 3 minutes after the first explosion, there was a second explosion. This one was even more powerful than the first. Another massive fireball erupted from the building, shooting upward and outward, completely engulfing the aerial ladder and everyone on it. The thermal pulse was so intense that it melted the plastic components of firefighters' helmets. It burned through their protective hoods, the fabric barriers that protect their necks and ears. It caused second and third degree burns on exposed skin and even on skin that was covered by protective equipment. One firefighter on the aerial ladder tried to descend faster but found his axe, a standard tool carried by firefighters, had somehow gotten wedged between the rungs of the ladder. The axe caught and held, trapping him on the burning ladder. He pulled desperately, but the axe wouldn't come free. I felt like there was 300 pounds attached to me, he later said. I couldn't move up or down, the ladder was burning my hands, flames were all around me, and I was stuck. Other firefighters on the ladder considered jumping. They looked down at the street 30 feet below and seriously contemplated leaping off the ladder to escape the flames. But the street itself was on fire. The intense heat had ignited homeless encampments and debris on the sidewalks. There was no safe place to land. One firefighter closed his eyes and began praying. I just asked God to please stop the pain, he later recalled. I thought I was going to die right there on that ladder. I couldn't see how we were going to survive this. At 7:04 p.m., a Mayday call went out over the radio, the emergency code that means firefighters are in immediate life-threatening danger. Mayday, 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 multiple firefighters trapped on the aerial. We need help now. The Mayday call galvanized everyone on scene. Firefighters who had made it safely off the building immediately reversed course and ran back to help. The aerial ladder operator, who had been trying to hold the ladder steady while it was being used as an escape route, now had to figure out how to help the trapped firefighters without making things worse. Captain Barkley, who had made it off the roof and was on the aerial ladder when the second explosion hit, found himself being pulled downward with tremendous force. Another firefighter below him on the ladder had grabbed his legs and was physically pulling him down, trying to speed his descent and clear the way for others above. The force was so great that Barkley's tools and equipment came loose and fell. Another firefighter described being pulled so hard that he ended up dangling upside down off the side of the ladder, held only by the grip of the colleague who had grabbed his foot to keep him from falling. Hanging inverted, flames all around, equipment falling off, he somehow managed to right himself and continue down. Inside the building, the firefighters who had been advancing down the narrow hallway were now in a desperate fight for survival. The explosion had occurred behind them, cutting off their primary exit route, but there was nowhere else to go. The hallway dead-ended, and they were surrounded by burning storage racks piled floor to ceiling. They tried to crawl backward toward the entrance but immediately encountered that ladder obstacle they'd noted earlier, except now it was worse. The blast had knocked the ladder sideways, leaving it at a 45-degree angle across the narrow hallway, blocking even more of the passage than before. Where there had been a tight 2-foot gap to squeeze through, there was now barely any space at all. One firefighter, trying to move the ladder out of the way, made the mistake of standing up slightly to get better leverage. The instant he raised his upper body, he felt excruciating pain across his back. The superheated gas layer that hung near the ceiling, temperatures that could exceed 1000 degrees Fahrenheit, burned through his protective coat in seconds. His shirt caught fire, his skin blistered and began to char. He dropped back down, screaming in agony. "Stay low, someone shouted. "The heat is killing us up high." The firefighters had to crawl, staying as close to the floor as possible, where temperatures were marginally cooler. But even at floor level, the heat was intense enough to be felt through their protective equipment. Their facepieces, the clear visors on their breathing apparatus, were fogging and melting. Their gloves were burning. The floor itself was becoming too hot to touch. They reached the ladder obstacle and realized there was no way to move it. It was wedged too tightly, and they didn't have room to maneuver. They would have to go over it, or somehow squeeze past it. In full protective gear, in zero visibility, with the building burning around them, while trying to stay low enough to avoid the lethal heat above. One by one, they forced themselves through the impossibly narrow gap. Some went over the ladder, burning their hands on the hot metal. Others tried to squeeze between the ladder and the storage racks, their equipment catching and snagging on every projection. One firefighter got stuck, his air tank wedged against the ladder, unable to move forward or backward. The firefighter behind him had to push and pull to free him, seconds ticking away, air supplies running low, heat intensifying. They made it past the ladder and continued crawling toward the entrance. But the narrow hallway seemed endless. In the smoke and darkness, disoriented and exhausted, distance was impossible to judge. Seconds felt like minutes. They crawled over their own fire hoses, over debris that had fallen from the storage racks, over equipment they'd dropped. Some firefighters were crawling over each other in the desperate rush to escape. One member of Engine 9's crew, unable to continue down the burning hallway, made a split-second decision that probably saved his life. He crawled sideways onto the storage racks themselves, climbing up onto the shelving to get above the worst of the smoke and heat. It was counterintuitive. Climbing up in a fire is usually fatal because heat rises. But the storage racks created air gaps and metal barriers that provided some protection from the direct flames. He crawled across the tops of the racks like a bridge, finding a route that bypassed the blocked hallway below. Others followed his lead, climbing onto the racks and crawling desperately toward any source of light or fresh air. The racks swayed under their weight, merchandise falling and burning around them. At any moment, the racks could collapse, sending them falling into the inferno below. But staying in the hallway meant certain death, so they climbed. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, but was probably less than 2 minutes, the first firefighters from the interior crew emerged from the building. They crawled out of the side door they'd entered through, their equipment smoking and charred, their protective gear burned through in multiple places, their skin blistered and bleeding. They collapsed on the street, unable to stand, barely able to breathe despite their air supplies. Some rolled on the ground, trying to extinguish spots on their clothing that were still burning. Others simply lay still, too injured and exhausted to move, waiting for help to reach them. "I'm literally crawling in the street now and I'm looking around and it's a ghost town," one firefighter later recalled. "Nobody's around. I'm thinking, where is everybody? And then I realize, everybody else is hurt too. Everybody else is trying to survive. I was thinking somebody would help me, but everybody needed help." The scene outside the building was absolute chaos. Injured firefighters were scattered across the street and sidewalk, some trying to help others, some too injured to move. The radiant heat from the building was still so intense that it was igniting debris and homeless encampments on the opposite side of the street, more than 30 feet away from the building itself. "Please somebody, just spray water on me," one firefighter shouted. "My head is on fire. My arms are on fire. Somebody help me." Scott Brennan, an engineer from Engine 9 who had been operating the pump on one of the fire trucks, grabbed a hose line and began spraying water on his injured teammates. The water provided some relief from the burning, cooling their superheated protective gear and extinguishing spots that were still smoldering. But it was a stopgap measure. These men needed immediate medical attention. Back on the aerial ladder, firefighters were still trapped. The crew members who had made it safely off the building ran back to help, climbing up the ladder despite the heat and flames. They grabbed the arms and legs of trapped colleagues and physically pulled them downward, using brute force to overcome the obstacles and injuries that were preventing escape. Captain Barkley was pulled headfirst down the ladder with such violence that his helmet came off, his air tank loosened, and his radio was torn free. He later said it felt like being dragged down a cheese grater. Every rung of the hot metal ladder scraped against him as he was pulled downward. But the rough treatment got him off the ladder alive, which was what mattered. Another firefighter ended up dangling upside down, held only by a colleague's grip on his boot. The person pulling him didn't have time to reposition or adjust. They just grabbed whatever they could reach and pulled. The trapped firefighter, hanging inverted with flames all around, somehow managed to twist himself around and continue descending, his hands so badly burned that he could barely grip the ladder rungs. The last firefighter made it off the aerial ladder at approximately 7:06 p.m., just 5 minutes after the first explosion, though it had felt like hours to those trapped on the burning ladder. As soon as the ladder was clear, the operator retracted it and moved the truck back from the building, which was now fully engulfed in flames. By 7:10 p.m., commanders on scene were conducting a desperate accounting of their personnel. The Mayday call had indicated multiple firefighters in distress, but in the chaos and confusion, nobody knew exactly how many were injured or where they all were. Command to all units, I need a personnel accountability report now. How many firefighters are down? What's their condition? The reports came in piecemeal over the next few minutes, painting a picture of disaster. 2 firefighters down in front of the truck, 6 more on the front side of the building, others scattered across the street and sidewalk. Some were being helped by colleagues, others were lying motionless, too injured to move. We need ambulances. Multiple firefighters down, we need help now. Los Angeles Fire Department protocols immediately kicked into gear. Additional ambulances were dispatched from across the city. The closest trauma center, LAC+USC Medical Center, was alerted to prepare for multiple burn victims. Commanders began organizing the evacuation of the injured, prioritizing those with the most severe injuries. The first ambulances arrived within minutes and began loading the most critically injured firefighters. Paramedics, many of whom knew these firefighters personally, some were colleagues from other stations, others were friends, worked with grim efficiency to stabilize patients and transport them to the hospital. One by one the injured were evacuated. Some could walk with assistance, others had to be carried on stretchers. The most severely injured were placed on backboards and loaded carefully into ambulances, their burned skin so fragile that even gentle handling caused intense pain. Captain Barkley was among the critically injured. His hands were severely burned. His face was blistered, and he had burns on his neck and ears where his protective hood had failed. But he refused to leave until he knew all his crew members were accounted for and being cared for. Only when other commanders physically told him to get in an ambulance did he finally consent to evacuation. While the injured were being transported to hospitals, the fire itself continued to burn. The building was now fully engulfed, with flames shooting from every opening. Additional fire companies had arrived to relieve the personnel from Station 9 and continue fighting the blaze, but the priority had shifted. This was no longer about saving the building, which was clearly going to be a total loss. This was about preventing the fire from spreading to adjacent structures and about figuring out what had caused this disaster. Commanders pulled firefighters back to defensive positions, meaning they would fight the fire from outside rather than entering the building. After what had just happened, nobody was going into that structure again until it was confirmed safe. Instead, multiple fire streams were set up, pouring thousands of gallons of water per minute onto the burning building from the safety of the street. The fire fought them for hours. Whatever was burning inside that building was producing tremendous heat and seemed to have an almost unlimited fuel supply. Every time it seemed like the flames were being knocked down, they would surge back up even stronger. Commanders suspected there were additional hazardous materials inside, possibly more butane, possibly other flammables, that were continuing to fuel the fire. 3 blocks away, Geraldine Cleveland had been watching the incident unfold from the rooftop of her apartment building. She had heard the first explosion clearly, a boom so loud that everyone in her building thought a bomb had gone off. When she looked toward Boyd Street, she saw what she later described as a mushroom cloud, like a miniature atomic bomb. "I've lived in LA my whole life," Cleveland later told reporters. "I've seen fires before. This was nothing like that. This was an explosion, a huge fireball that went up into the sky, and then I saw the firefighters on that ladder, and I realized they were in trouble. I just prayed they would make it down." The explosion had been powerful enough that it blackened a fire engine parked across the street from the building, not from direct flame contact, but from the radiant heat and the blast wave. The engine's paint was scorched, its windows were cracked, and equipment mounted on its exterior was damaged. If the truck had been closer, it likely would have been destroyed. Inside the burning building, temperatures had reached levels that were literally melting the structure. Steel beams were sagging. The roof, which firefighters had been standing on just minutes earlier, collapsed into the building. Windows that hadn't already been blown out by the explosions now shattered from the thermal stress. The building was being consumed from the inside out. Finally, at 8:08 p.m., 1 hour and 42 minutes after the first units had arrived on what they thought was a routine structure fire, commanders declared the major emergency blaze extinguished. The building was a burned-out shell, barely standing, but the fire itself was finally under control. Over 230 Los Angeles Fire Department firefighters had responded to the incident. That number itself was testament to how serious the situation had become. A routine structure fire might involve 2 or 3 fire companies, maybe 20 firefighters. This fire had required resources from across the entire city, with companies coming from miles away to help. But the fire being out didn't mean the crisis was over. At LAC+USC Medical Center, doctors and nurses were fighting to save the lives and limbs of 11 severely injured firefighters. The burn unit had been overwhelmed, with multiple critical patients arriving nearly simultaneously, all requiring immediate intensive care. 3 of the injured firefighters were in critical but stable condition. 2 had been placed on ventilators to protect their airways and assist their breathing, a necessary measure when someone has inhaled superheated gases that have damaged their lungs. Others had severe burns covering significant portions of their bodies, requiring immediate surgical intervention to remove dead tissue and begin the long process of grafting and reconstruction. Captain Barkley was among the most seriously injured. He had 2nd and 3rd degree burns on his hands, arms, face, neck, and ears. The burns on his hands were particularly severe, the tissue was charred in some places, and doctors weren't sure how much function he would retain. He would need multiple surgeries just for the initial treatment, with more procedures to follow during recovery and rehabilitation. The medical team worked through the night, performing emergency surgeries, managing pain, monitoring for complications. Burn injuries are among the most serious trauma cases because they don't just affect the skin, they impact the entire body's systems. Severe burns can cause shock, kidney failure, infection, respiratory problems, and numerous other life-threatening conditions. The first 72 hours are the most critical. Families began arriving at the hospital, having been notified that their loved ones had been injured. They gathered in waiting rooms, supporting each other, waiting for updates from doctors, praying for good news. The tight-knit firefighting community mobilized, off-duty firefighters showed up to donate blood, to offer support, to be there for their brothers and sisters in their time of need. Meanwhile, back at the scene on Boyd Street, fire investigators were beginning the process of determining what had caused this disaster. They couldn't enter the building yet, it was still too hot, and the structure was too unstable. But they could examine the exterior, interview witnesses, and start collecting information. The pattern of the fire's damage provided immediate clues. The most severe destruction was at the rear of the building, suggesting that's where the fire had originated, and where it had burned hottest. The blast damage blown out walls, scattered debris, the mushroom cloud witnesses had described, indicated an explosion rather than a typical fire spread. And the timing of the explosions, coming after firefighters were already on scene, suggested that something had been heated to a critical point before failing catastrophically. Investigators interviewed firefighters as they were released from the hospital, or while they waited for treatment. Despite their injuries and trauma, the firefighters provided detailed accounts of what they'd experienced, the unusual smoke behavior, the popping sounds, the building shaking, the explosions. These first-hand observations would be crucial to understanding what had happened. But the most important evidence would come from examining the building itself and determining what had been stored inside. Investigators needed to know what business operated in this building, what products they sold or stored, and whether any of those products could explain the explosions and intense fire behavior. In the days following the incident, as firefighters underwent surgeries and began the painful process of recovery, investigators conducted over 60 formal interviews. They spoke with every firefighter who had been on scene, with witnesses from the neighborhood, with other businesses on Boyd Street, and with building department officials who had records of the property. What they discovered was disturbing. The building at 327 East Boyd Street housed a business called Smoke Tokes, a wholesale supplier of products for the butane honey oil extraction industry. For those unfamiliar, butane honey oil (BHO) is a concentrated cannabis extract produced by using butane as a solvent. The process is extremely dangerous because butane is highly flammable, and the extraction process can produce explosive vapor concentrations if not done properly in specialized facilities. Smoke Tokes wasn't manufacturing BHO. That would have been even more dangerous and almost certainly illegal in this location. But they were supplying the tools and materials used in the process, which meant they were storing large quantities of butane and related products. As investigators sifted through the wreckage, they found the remnants of thousands of butane canisters, the small pressurized cylinders used for refilling lighters and torches. They also found evidence of nitrous oxide whippets, small cartridges containing compressed nitrous oxide, commonly sold for whipped cream dispensers but often misused as an inhalant drug. The building's layout provided additional crucial information. The structure was divided into two sections separated by a partition wall. Unit A at the front of the building contained ordinary merchandise, glassware, smoking accessories, typical retail inventory. But Unit B, at the rear where the fire had originated and burned hottest, was filled with pallets stacked floor to ceiling with butane canisters and nitrous oxide cartridges. The partition wall between the two units wasn't properly fire-rated or sealed, a violation of building codes that should have been caught during inspections. This meant that fire could easily spread from one unit to the other, which is exactly what had happened. Investigators determined the following sequence of events. A fire started in Unit B, probably from an electrical malfunction or other ignition source. As the fire grew, it began heating the thousands of butane canisters and nitrous oxide cartridges stored in the space. The nitrous oxide cartridges began venting at approximately 106 degrees Fahrenheit, a relatively low temperature easily reached in a structure fire. Nitrous oxide is an oxidizer, meaning it helps things burn more intensely. As the cartridges vented, they released concentrated oxygen into the fire environment, dramatically increasing the fire's intensity and heat output. This explained the unusual smoke behavior firefighters had observed. The wavy, distorted appearance was caused by extreme heat. As temperatures continued to rise, the butane canisters began failing. Butane is extremely flammable, and when released in a confined space with an ignition source, it creates an explosive mixture. The popping sounds firefighters heard were individual canisters exploding. The rumbling and shaking were hundreds or thousands of canisters failing simultaneously, releasing their contents in a massive deflagration. The building's narrow, deep layout, approximately 70 yards long but only 30 feet wide, acted like a nozzle or gun barrel, focusing and channeling the explosion. Instead of expanding in all directions, the blast wave was forced forward toward the front of the building, amplifying its power. This was why the firefighters near the entrance and on the roof experienced such devastating force. They were directly in the path of a channeled explosion. The second explosion occurred when additional butane canisters in another part of the building reached failure temperature. The first explosion's heat and pressure had created ideal conditions for a secondary blast. The cycle could have continued indefinitely if firefighters hadn't pulled back and allowed the building to burn itself out from a distance. The investigation revealed multiple violations and failures. The building owner had allowed hazardous materials to be stored in quantities far exceeding what was legal for this type of structure. No proper permits had been obtained, no fire suppression systems were installed. Storage practices violated every applicable fire code. Materials stacked to the ceiling, blocking exits, creating fuel loads that turned the building into a bomb waiting for ignition. But there was no criminal prosecution. The building owner claimed ignorance of what the tenant was storing. The tenant's business records were destroyed in the fire. Without clear evidence of willful negligence, prosecutors determined they couldn't prove criminal intent. It was a frustrating outcome for the injured firefighters and their families who felt that someone should be held accountable for the disaster. The 11 injured firefighters faced long, painful recoveries. Captain Barkley underwent 25 surgeries and counting to repair his burned hands and restore function. Other firefighters faced similar ordeals with multiple surgeries, skin grafts, physical therapy, and ongoing medical treatment. But the physical injuries were only part of the trauma. Many of the firefighters developed PTSD from the incident. They experienced nightmares, anxiety, difficulty returning to duty. Some couldn't continue as firefighters, their careers ended by injuries or psychological trauma. The incident affected not just the 11 who were injured, but their families, their colleagues, and the entire Station 9 crew who had to process what had happened. The Los Angeles Fire Department implemented new policies in response to the Boyd Street fire. They mandated that firefighters wear their breathing apparatus face pieces and go on air using their air tanks earlier in firefighting operations, even before entering structures. Previous protocols had allowed firefighters to delay going on air to conserve their limited air supply, but the Boyd Street fire demonstrated that toxic smoke and superheated gases could appear suddenly and without warning. The department also enhanced training on recognizing signs of hazmat incidents and unusual fire behavior. The wavy, distorted smoke that one firefighter had observed should have been recognized as a warning sign of extreme heat and potential explosion risk. Better training helps firefighters identify these danger signals earlier and make better tactical decisions.